How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Lorcana Cave. So, a lot of you guys were very interested in my last budget video, so I wanted to bring you guys another budget video. I've been having a lot of problems trying to get together decks for reasonable prices with how the market is right now. So I've been scouring eBay for certain cards, trying to get them cheap. And one of the cheapest decks that you can get that is somewhat competitive is red green aggro. And so I wanted to make 3 different deck lists, 2 of which I've run. The last one I haven't. We'll get to that when we get to it. But I think red green aggro is a pretty reasonably priced deck to be able to put together. There's going to be 3 different budgets. The first one is a $25 budget if you already have the red green starter deck. If you don't, it'll cost you about $33. So we're going to call it a $25 budget deck. The second deck is a $100 budget. Around there, it floats between 90 and about 110 depending on the price of some of the cards. And the last one was a top 8 deck from the loot box games 1K. I made a few changes to that deck, so I'll put that deck list up afterwards, but we're going to go over the main 1K. That's a $200 budget. My changes make it slightly more expensive, but we'll get to why I kind of made some of those changes. Maybe I don't know what I'm talking about. He did get top 8, so maybe his list is better. But we'll get to that. So first up, let's talk about the starter deck upgrade. So what I tried to do with this is allow players with the starter deck to upgrade for a reasonable price. And the way to do that is to try to use as many cards that are in the starter deck as possible. Because they're in the starter deck and they're in booster packs, the prices of them don't inflate too high. And so you're able to get them for a reasonable price. And so the deck that I have here runs obviously the Aladdin combo with the regular Aladdin and then Shift Aladdin. The only cards that are added that aren't a part of the starter deck is Mulan. I added 3 copies of Mulan. You could probably swap her out for maybe a Goofy for just better aggro. But what I found with Mulan is at your LGS, you're probably going to run into a lot of other aggro decks. And this deck isn't quite as fast as, your top aggro decks, but not as slow as some of the mid-range decks. So it floats right in between there. And some of the cards like Mulan, as well as Shift Aladdin, let you combat those faster aggro decks while letting you still outpace them towards the mid game. So it gives you some board control for those aggro decks. And then you have cards like Dragonfire and Mother Knows Best to combat those mid-range decks and slow them down, bounce some cards back while you try to get those last bits of lore. At a certain point, obviously with aggro decks, you're going to run out of steam. And I think this deck is a pretty well put together deck. I played it on Pixelborn a bit. I played an altered version live. I don't have this exact deck to run live. I do, but I have a couple copies of Hans and a copy of Cusco. So I ran those in and I swapped some of the cards out. However, this deck has been doing pretty well for me on Pixelborn as far as starter deck upgrades go. And it's pretty successful. So this is a great deck for those of you who just want to put together something that works well to go play at your LGS. I encourage you to check this one out and pick it up because it's pretty cheap. The next deck we're going to go over is the $100 budget aggro. I went over this list in my last budget video, so I'm not going to go over it too much. I went into detail in that video. If you want to see me talk about it in more detail, go check out that video. But this deck, the main investment is going to be 4 copies of Cusco. At the moment, they're sitting around $15. I was able to find a copy on eBay for, I think, $11 shipped. So I encourage you guys to check out eBay for some of these higher value cards. It will take you a little bit longer to get them and a little bit longer to kind of get lucky, but throw offers out on eBay. Try to get these Cuscos for, $10 a piece, $11 a piece. It's going to be a little bit difficult to do at the moment, but if you can, that trims down the budget of this deck list by $20. So again, most of your investment for this list is the 4 copies of Cusco. So this is kind of the list that I'm building towards right now. Instead of running 4 copies of Cusco, I don't have 4 copies. I'm running Hans instead. So if you want to cut down the budget for this list a bit, you can swap out Cusco for Hans. Obviously not as effective because you don't have Ward, and Cusco with Shield of Virtue gives you that extra reach, which is pretty nutty. but Hans will kind of do the same thing, but obviously your opponent can remove Hans a lot easier. So give this deck a shot if you're under the $100 range or in the $100 range. This is what I'm shooting for my LGS. I'll feel comfortable playing this and like paying an entry fee and knowing that I'll have some type of shot at winning. Obviously, it's going to be a lot more difficult to beat some of the top meta decks, but at a lot of LGSs, not a lot of players are playing these top meta decks yet. So you got a little bit of wiggle room and a little bit of leeway on how strong your deck can be. The next deck and the last-ish deck we're going to go over is the deck by Luis Riera. This was for the loot box games 1K that happened a few days ago or last week. I think it was just a few days ago, but he got top 8 with it. It's an interesting list. Notably, there's no Mad Hatters, which is crazy to me. He's only running 2 copies of Hans, and he's running the Aladdin combo. A lot of top decks for Ruby Emerald aren't running the Aladdin combo. A lot of people think that it's too slow, and if you don't have card draw, it's a little bit difficult and a little bit clunky to play. However, he found success with it. I'm a fan of the Aladdin combo. I think it's just fun to play. Is this going to be the top end-all be-all for Emerald Ruby? I don't think so. I did make some changes to this list to fit my playstyle and what I'm trying to do a little bit better, but we'll go through this list in a little bit more detail. You have the 2 1-drops, Tibbs and Duke. You have 4 copies. Flynn Rider, of course, at 2 cost. LeFou, you have a really effective card. He kind of acts as a pseudo 1-turn Shield of Virtue. This deck is running 4 copies of Shield of Virtue, which I think is a lot, so we'll go over my deck list afterwards. 4 copies of Jasper. I've never been a huge Jasper fan, but the more I've played with the card, the more it's kind of grown on me. So 4 copies of Jasper, obviously the 4 Aladdins, 2 copies of Hans. I'm not sure why he's not running 4 copies. I think Hans is a very strong card, especially for 4. 4 cost quest for 3 is pretty insane. But he's only running 2 copies. And then Tinkerbell, obviously one of the better evasives, along with Pongo. Pongo and Tinkerbell are going to win you a lot of games. They're just going to stick on the board, and they essentially put your opponent on a turn timer. A lot of the times you're going to get them out, and they're just going to quest every turn. Put your opponent on a 5-turn, 4-turn timer, depending on where you are at in the game. If you get both of them out, put your opponent on even a less of a timer. Followed by 4 copies of Cusco, of course. Arguably the strongest card in Red Green Aggro. Not arguably, it is the strongest card in Red Green Aggro. That's why it's $15. Followed by Goofy. There's 4 copies of Goofy in here. 4 copies of Genie on the job. Fantastic against your mid-range decks to try to give you just that extra little bit of reach. 4 copies of John Silver. $18 for this card. So if you really want to trim down the cost of this deck, this is where you're going to cut. Maybe run 2 copies. Maybe don't run any copies. 4 copies of Shift Aladdin, of course. 2 copies of Mother Knows Best. With Genie, you don't necessarily need 4 copies of Mother Knows Best to combat those mid-range decks, because you kind of get that effect and you're able to bounce cards with Genie. And then 4 copies of Shield of Virtue. For those of you who don't know yet, Shield of Virtue Cusco, Shield of Virtue Hans, the ability to untap or unexert, ready up, whatever you want to call it, to untap these cards and almost guarantee questing for 3 the following turn is pretty nuts. A lot of times with these kinds of decks, you're going to find yourself slowly running out of steam, and you're going to have 14 lore, and you need that last 6, and you're going to throw down a Cusco. He's going to quest once. You're going to be able to ready him up with Shield of Virtue. They're not going to be able to deal with him, and you're going to be able to quest for that last 3 while your hand is empty, and it's a fantastic feeling when you're able to do that. So great deck. I have not played with this one, but obviously it works very well. It did top 8. I want to go over the list that I made. There's a few changes in my list. I took out the 4 copies of Goofy that he is running, and I'm running 4 copies of Mad Hatter. I'm sure he tried this change, and I'm sure Goofy worked better for him with the evasive and, again, putting your opponent on a turn combo. Maybe Goofy was able to get him more lore over the long run, but I'm a big fan of Mad Hatter at the moment, so I swapped out the 4 copies of Goofy for 4 copies of Mad Hatter. I added in 2 copies of Hans. I removed 1 copy of Shield of Virtue, and I removed 1 copy of LeFaux. I don't think you need that many Shield of Virtues. I don't think you need that many LeFaux. You're not going to play LeFaux early unless it's really your only 2-drop that you have in hand. And having too many of them isn't great either. So 3 copies and 3 copies of Shield of Virtue. This is the list that I'm going to try out. But obviously, I mean, I'm not putting in the play testing to get to these final lists that these other guys are. So maybe his list is better, but it just felt wrong not running 4 Hans and not running Mad Hatters in the deck. So these are the changes that I made. Let me know if you guys try any of these decks, and let me know how they work out for you. I want to bring you guys budget decks and budget options, especially right now with what the singles market looks like in Lorcana. It's pretty insane. But cards are coming down in price. They're going to come down when more product gets released. But I wanted to give you guys some options of decks to play at your LGS, so you can go out, you can play in person. You know, I've felt like for the last month, my first time playing was a couple weeks ago in person. I've had to play on Pixelborn just because I couldn't get cards for a reasonable price, couldn't find product to open boosters. I got lucky and I was able to get a couple starter decks, 1 online on Target and then 1 at my LGS for one of the events that they had. So anyways, give these decks a shot. Let me know how they turn out for you. And as usual, if you love all things Lorcana, make sure you like and subscribe, hit the bell. I'll see you in the next one.